Uh, so good afternoon. Thank you for attending our webinar for Your Way Together. For those who are new to our webinars, we are from Co-operatives First. Co-operatives First is a business development organization created to bring awareness of the cooperative model to rural and Indigenous communities throughout Canada. We are located in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on Treaty 6 territory, not far from the Wanuskewin Heritage Park that has been a meeting place for people across the Northern Plains for over 6,000 years. And we are the homeland of the Métis. So I am Trista Pewapisconias, the Indigenous Relations Lead at Co-operatives First, and I have Kyle White, our Governance and Education Lead with us today. So as the Indigenous Relations Lead, I work directly with Indigenous communities, groups, and individuals who are looking to start cooperative businesses in their community. The co-op structure is not a new concept and has been used in Indigenous communities for thousands of years and continue to do so. So, such as the newly incorporated Elders Co-op that was established to preserve the Saulteaux language and the culture, and to the River Select Fishermen's Co-op, where 8 individual communities work together to source their ethically sourced fish globally, to numerous arts co-ops. Today, I'm honored to have Dr. Priscilla Settee and Dr. Kathy Walker join me today to talk about co-ops and social economies as tools for economic reconciliation. Dr. Priscilla Settee is an activist and an award-winning scholar whose research focuses on Indigenous food sovereignty, Indigenous knowledge, social economies, and the impact of climate change. She is the author and editor of several books, a David Suzuki Research Fellow, and produced the study Owan Nikiwak and the Lad. Priscilla is also a member of the Cumberland House Cree Nation in northern Saskatchewan and is one of 21 Indigenous organizers, activists, and social entrepreneurs and cultural practitioners from across North America named as the 2021 NDN Changemaker Fellow. Dr. Kathy Walker is a Nehio Israel with Métis, Saulteaux, and Nakota lineages and is from the Economies First Nation in Treaty 4 territory. She is a proud mother, auntie, Gookum, to one daughter, numerous nieces and nephews. In addition, she is an assistant professor in political studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Most of her professional life has been spent working for Indigenous, political, and nonprofit organizations on community programs and policy development initiatives. Her community connections continue to inform her research, including volunteer work with local organizations such as the Saskatchewan Homelessness Advisory Board and Harvest Community Inc. Her research focuses on the resurgence of the Nehio and Indigenous knowledge systems and their Wakatawin with critical political analysis and care ethics. So thank you so much for joining me today. Kathy, you are on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Trista, and thank you all for being here. now. I'm just going to introduce myself in Nehio Wewin. Kathy Walker, Nisiga Sun, Okini Sochinia, Kayate, Maga, Saskatoon, Minakagok, Miigwech. So just wanted to do that because I like to use Nehio Wewin whenever I can, the little bit that I know. So I'm just going to share a PowerPoint here that put together to help. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see it?
Yes.
Can
Yes.
come up and it's in presenter mode? Okay, great. Okay, so my analysis is actually going to focus more on the concept of economic reconciliation and its relationship to Indigenous and social economies. And then Dr. Settee is going to talk about what Indigenous and social economies are and how co-ops are key to rebuilding them. So there's our presentation outline. Probably should have had it on that slide when I said that. But anyway, my portion is going to be much shorter than Dr. Settee, just because she's one of the leading scholars and activists in social economy building here in Saskatchewan. And my contribution is more from the point of view of economic reconciliation and its relationship with resurgence, and then its connection to social economy building. So right now, as most of us know, there's two dominant political movements impacting Indigenous peoples and Canadians. And so one is what we call reconciliation, and the other is what you might call Indigenous resurgence. And as we're probably all aware, reconciliation really became a movement after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its final report in 2015. In setting out its 94 calls to action for all levels of government, educational institutions, faith organizations, businesses, and so on, the TRC really did call on all segments of society to act to address the legacy of residential schools and other colonial policy. And included in these 94 calls to action is one call on economic reconciliation. And I think one of the best ways I've heard to sum up the connection between residential schools and the work of the TRC and economic reconciliation is the fact that while governments were busy trying to take the Indian out of the child, they were also taking the Indian or Indigenous peoples out of the economy. So for a long time, as a lot of us know, our traditional local Indigenous economies were all but destroyed by various government policies, and Indigenous peoples, and as Indigenous peoples, we were cut off for the most part from accessing other economic opportunities or ways of life, or ways to make a living or a livelihood. So that's just a little bit of background on the genesis or the roots of economic reconciliation. Indigenous resurgence, on the other hand, is not rooted in the TRC. Instead, it's grounded in the revitalization of our Indigenous knowledge systems. And in terms of the economy, resurgence does not separate our livelihoods from our communities, our cultures, our languages, our laws, and so on. And it doesn't measure wealth in terms of profit alone. So some people think that one of the problems with reconciliation is that it's somewhat separate from Indigenous resurgence, or that the two movements are not necessarily aligned with one another and that they need to be. So I would tend to agree. And so what I want to do next is just take a closer look at economic reconciliation as set out by the TRC and how we can ensure that reconciliation or economic reconciliation is connected with Indigenous resurgence. Because I believe that the building of Indigenous and social economies is vital to achieving what you would call resurgent economic reconciliation. Okay, so again, just to kind of start with the TRC definition then of what economic reconciliation is. The TRC in its call to action on economic reconciliation is actually made up of 3 sections. And these are all directed at corporate Canada to commit to the following. So in section 1, there's a mandate for meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. Now, Section 2 asks corporate Canada to commit to providing education, asks corporate Canada to commit to ensuring that Indigenous peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Indigenous communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. And then finally, in Section 3, corporate Canada is asked to commit to providing education for its management and staff on the history of Indigenous peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. And in the third section, the TRC also notes that a proper education on these topics will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So that's basically the content of Section 92 as set out by the TRC. So a lot of analysis has been done since 2015, since the TRC came out with its calls to action. So a lot of analysis has been done to show how economic reconciliation is actually being translated into action or policy primarily by corporations and governments, and also, Indigenous nations. So I believe that basically from the TRC call to action here, there's actually two visions of economic reconciliation that are being pursued. So the first is what I'm calling an affirmative vision of economic reconciliation. And this affirmative vision is primarily rooted in the second and third sections of the call to action. And I call it affirmative because this approach is basically based on affirming Indigenous people's right to economic parity with Canadians. It also seeks to ensure that Indigenous peoples have equitable access and opportunities in workplaces and in business development, and that we finally close, the gaping socioeconomic disparity that exists between most Indigenous peoples and Canadians. So this approach also does seek to create more awareness, education, and training that can make workplaces more welcoming for Indigenous peoples. So, these reforms that are being taken as part of this approach to economic reconciliation, I believe are generally improving, the well-being of Indigenous peoples and everyone else as well. But the one thing, though, is that if we stop at this approach, then I feel we miss the opportunity to fundamentally change the structure of Canadian Indigenous relations in a way that truly supports Indigenous self-determination, or that enables Indigenous entrepreneurs and business developers and communities to define what long-term sustainability means, from the community up. So basically, this type of economic reconciliation, doesn't really ask those transformative questions of what worldview or ways of knowing are governing, your economy or your economic action, or how do we honor Indigenous people's distinct relationships with the living earth in our economic actions, or, what about the question of what if an Indigenous nation refuses a particular type of economic development that the Canadian state and a Canadian business supports? So under this approach, Indigenous peoples may have a larger share of the existing pie, but I think we're held back from remaking the pie, or maybe even deciding on the filling, you know, like who knows, maybe we want to eat cake, or maybe we want to eat moose nose, I don't know. But, you know, our choices are kind of limited under this approach, because it really tends to affirm, you know, the status quo way of doing things. So that brings me to what I think is the other vision that's inherent in call to action number 92, which is reflected more in the first section. And this vision can be called, well, I call it the transformative vision. So if you recall, section 1 emphasized UNDRIP and the need for obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and building partnerships with Indigenous peoples based on respect and meaningful consultation. So I believe that FPIC requires that relationships are established in which the self-determination of Indigenous nations are respected and honored. And so this means that representatives of government and industry must become more aware of Indigenous rights and cultures, as well as their and ours relational responsibilities, you know, in all the roles that we occupy, while fulfilling the duty to consult. And it also means that as Indigenous nations or peoples, we're not being governed from a top-down external authority, but instead we're governed by our community's ideas of what it means to be wealthy or to engage in long-term sustainable development. So right now, there's actually no formal body to monitor the implementation of the calls to action, or call to action number 92. There's some bodies, obviously, that are doing that more on an informal basis. One of those bodies is the media. So for instance, CBC News analyzed the implementation of all the 94 calls to action in 2018. And when it looked at call to action number 92, according to all the different analysis of all the different things that it reported on that are happening, what it found is that there's limited gains being made regarding equitable access to corporate sector jobs for Indigenous peoples. So that's more the affirmative approach. They said there's some limited gains there. But they also stated explicitly that the corporate sector has not collectively adopted UNDRIP, nor has it formally committed to management level training of UNDRIP and the legacy of residential schools. So that just gives you a, and I've looked at some other sources, and there's really no definitive answer on what's happening on the ground. But you know, I've looked at some additional sources as well, and it does seem to be more of an affirmative approach. So anyway, that's the general I think state of things. I mean, things are moving, things are changing. Indigenous nations are driving things for sure. But you know, but at the end of the day, you know, if reconciliation is truly a shared project, then I think one of the most important steps that we can collectively take is to further create the conditions to allow local and Indigenous economies to reemerge, because I think that's what leads to transformative alternatives. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Settee to talk about some of those alternatives.
Thank you. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes providing a background. It's mostly Saskatchewan centric, but you know, when I look across Canada, there are examples that also come to mind. So because Saskatchewan has been historically in the lead since almost time immemorial around the cooperative model of development, which is what we're here to partially discuss, it's a good example on how we can look to the past, and we can look to the present, and then we can look to the future. So Saskatchewan has really set the stage for the cooperative movement in the sense that cooperative Medicare began here. We had the wheat pool, farmers co-ops that worked on getting better prices for farmers' grains until it was legislated out of business, which was a tragedy for particularly Southerners, Southern Saskatchewan people. Also, cooperative development began from the margins. So we had large groups of Indigenous peoples, women, and youth, and in some sectors, some communities, the Jewish community that set up credit unions, and other groups set up small stores that operated cooperatively. And why did that happen? Because I think back in the day, and I'm including our Cree and other people in this analysis and in the history of co-ops, is that, you know, the cooperative movement actually began before Saskatchewan was a province. And so it developed that mindset and that operational mode because life was hard and people needed to cooperate in order to move forward and create, you know, meaningful opportunities in their communities. So cooperation was a principle that was in operation right from before Saskatchewan was a province. So in terms of how to move forward, it's important to look at those roots of cooperation and our own values, which I'm going to get into shortly. In this province, two early pioneers, Jim Brady and Malcolm Norris, were actually foundational Métis men that helped establish the cooperative, the CCF party, which is the precluder to the NDP political party. But on what I've read by people like David Quiring, there was always tension between what the state wanted and what Indigenous people wanted. And so that was problematic, but it's not to say that the movement was in vain. It did lead to powerful agencies like the Northern Fish Co-ops, which still have remnants of very powerful organizational and management styles. And those were established by the early hunters, trappers, and fishers, others who are land-based. And I recently did a David Suzuki Fellowship in which I examined the impact of development on the trapping economies. And my good friend and colleague, Dr. Isabel Finley, does a brilliant analysis of what exactly traditional economies that are land-based actually contribute to the gross national product, but also, and more importantly, the wellness of community. And she has done a lot of research with trappers in the northern part of our province, and she claims, as do the trappers that she interviewed, that trapping is not just an economic situation or production, but it's an actual way of life built on values that sustain communities and kept communities healthy. And, you know, prior to the capitalist development model that has really created a lot of despair in our communities, you know, we did have healthy communities. And if we look at the entire approach to social and economic development, it's a wonder in part that we are still alive, because you know, given the residential school experience tragedy, given the models of development that were forced upon us that took away the best land and put Indigenous people on swamps and rock piles, literally, and given the intentional destruction of food sources, you know, it's a wonder that we are still here. But I maintain that this way of life that hunters and trappers, that my parents uh, we're the saving grace and will continue to be the saving grace. And right now, if we fast forward to 2022, we see ourselves on the verge of an absolute economic and environmental collapse. What's happened out in British Columbia this last year with the wildfires and the flooding was absolutely disastrous. And we share those conditions as well here in Saskatchewan. Every year, our communities are just devastated by floods and fires. So we need to pose alternatives to the insane methodology of development that we are currently subjected to. And as Dr. Walker said, it's not even like we're being consulted meaningfully. It's like these are models of the development that have somehow, benefited the 1% with 44% of the world's wealth. So it's really important to look at how this model impacts the rest of the world, in particular Indigenous people. And I've taken a lot of time and travels to understand that by researching other Indigenous cultures in the world to understand that, you know, colonialism has deep roots, imperialism has even deeper roots, and we need to be very strongly critical because we are the people that have the knowledge that will help the planet survive. And it may sound really taxing and daunting, but I'm very hopeful because what I've seen, particularly with the Indigenous youth movements, is that they are not willing to just inherit this economic mess that our elders, I mean, people and systems has foisted on us. They are stopping the madness with their bodies. And, you know, when I look at some of the resistance movements throughout the globe and I see women and youth leading that movement, it really makes me very happy. Education has a lot to do with it as well. And through our deliberation, Dr. Walker and I have set out with other of our colleagues to really look deeply, to do a deep critique of what is being done and to build alternatives to that. So one of the models that we've looked at is the social economy model, which is in place in close to or over 100 Indigenous and First Nations communities across Canada. And one of the courses I developed on Indigenous social economy models looked at some of those communities. And what social economy models of economic development means is simply the building of alternative economic structures that reduce the poverty and social exclusion of Indigenous peoples and as well as others, because what is a good model for development for Indigenous people will be good development for all of society, given that we are the most in the margins here in the province and in Canada. And so we look at this time of globalization and the intensification of neoliberal and market-driven economic development to have a very deep understanding of how it's held in place by global rules and laws, national rules and laws. Kathy mentioned some of them, and of course, municipal rules and laws. So it is a wonder that we are still existing, given that most of these laws and rules work against us. But most of us, you know, we come from a very powerful legacy. When I think back to my own community and my family and the amazing knowledge base that really fueled our communities, I have no doubt that what is happening currently today in our communities are going to have a great ability to propel us forward in very good ways. But we must understand our own histories and even the histories of the cooperative movements and how we can link together to build stronger communities, and understand that it will take resistance. It will take talking back to dominant structures that Kathy mentioned in her presentation. We'll look at the next slide here. So I'm just going to spend the last few minutes on some of the data that we know impact us. Poverty in Saskatchewan is the highest in Canada, and poverty runs at 12.4% of Saskatchewan and 10.1% in Canada. And given the great economic semi-collapse that we are going through with the high prices of oil and gas and foodstuffs, cost of living, I'm certain that these percentages have actually gotten higher this year. And as I mentioned earlier, poverty is definitely higher among Indigenous peoples in Saskatchewan, 46% for First Nations in Saskatchewan, and even higher percentages for little children. So little children are the ones that are the most impacted. And as mentioned earlier, the policy that's based on neoliberal economics is failing the poor and the working poor in Saskatchewan. So as academics, we get, and community-based people, we get to, you know, talk about and to implement new models of thinking and doing. And we'll just move to the next slide. And we look into our cultural background, and one of the values that propels us, or that is very strong within our community, is the Cree value of Bimatsuin. And Bimatsuin is basically the good life. And in all the Indigenous nations I've ever spent time with, traveled to their communities, every tribal group has a concept of the good life that is first and foremost, you know, one of the primary factors in community living. And Indigenous groups globally have presented that through documents such as the UN UNDRIP, the document that took over 100 years to establish and that consulted with hundreds and thousands of Indigenous people throughout the globe on what needed to be done, what needs to be done. So at the heart of it is the definition of a social economy is that it has a social mission that guides program and policy. And as was mentioned previously, communities need to be fueled by other factors than just making a dollar. We need to really focus on how we are taking care of our most vulnerable, the elders, the youth, women, families. So social economies help us to focus on social missions that will guide program and policies. And one good example that we've worked on, my family, my partner, an agency through the Center for CCPA, Center for Policy Alternatives, has been alternative budgets. So basically what an alternative budget would do is to look at the needs of the most vulnerable, look at services that support good, healthy livelihoods, and put dollars towards that, kind of like an upstream budget, something that's put in place to prevent problems. So rather than, say, spending millions of dollars on treating diabetes, we might look at, what traditional food sources exist in the community. What are some of the excellent healthcare programs that are in community, rather than treating the sickness after the fact, which we all know costs a lot more in terms of money and really makes communities vulnerable. In Canada, the most active social economy projects exist in Quebec. And why is that so? Well, the Quebec government has prioritized social economies and directed funding towards it, because social economies, like all economic development, will not survive unless it is properly funded. So we have, for example, some of the examples of social economic projects are early childhood centers, domestic health services, recycling centers, public and community-based housing, social, recreation, and tourism initiatives, culture, communications, and more. And all of these are interlinked. Like, we know in the province that communications is a very important tool. And what did the Conservative government in this province do? They cut out a very lucrative and healthy film projects and proposals and funding. And we think that that was wrong. We lost a whole film industry because of that. And we had some excellent filmmakers and an excellent film industry. So these are, angles or sides of development that we need to really think deeply about how they're being supported by the state and what role they play. If you can just move to the next slide, please. And the profound realization that the economy isn't someone else's business, and that there's another way to organize the economy besides this neoliberal approach. I just want to stop here and talk a little bit about what is neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is a very intentional approach to economic development that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, and it directs all the wealth and development proceeds towards the very wealthy. It cuts back on things like laws that disempower communities. It doesn't honor the treaties and land claims that Canada is responsible for fulfilling. So it's a type of model of development that really focuses on the needs or the wants and the greeds of the rich. And so it's really important to understand that poverty is not somebody's fault, is not the individual who is poor. It's not their fault, but it's really managed by a larger systems that are put in place actually throughout the globe through international trade agreements that says Canada or the US can have access to Canada's fresh water and trees and minerals. And, our communities, like the one I come from in Cumberland House, is merely a hinterland for the wealth that's located in Bay Street, Toronto. So these are, kind of profound concepts of power and control. But it's really, we talk about this in our course development because we feel it's very important for communities to understand how globally wealth and power is organized and maintained by the very rich. And if it's going to be altered, it's because those of us on the ground level are knowledgeable and action oriented. And, working at a university like some of us do, we have great capacity to do that. Although universities have also been caught up in the neoliberal model of administration, where students are expected to pay more for tuition. There's cutbacks and increased teaching loads for professors. There's a growth of more administrative bodies at the cost of really, I would say, university student professor autonomy. So it's really established itself, neoliberalism, through all aspects of society: economic development, higher learning, the army, communications, all of that. And so if it's going to be addressed, it really needs to be addressed on all fronts. Finally, the social economy responds to society's needs, including quality of life, job creation, respect for the environment, use of natural resources, if that's what we choose. And in fact, some Indigenous people have maintained that we have no right to take all these resources just, to produce wealth. So I think that, as Kathy mentioned previously, free, prior, informed consent needs to be established before any more trappers' cabins get bulldozed, which we have seen in our north. And of course, access to communications. And the next slide. So, to reiterate, social economy serves its members in the maintenance of profits, so the profits stay in the communities. And as in a small example, let's take McDonald's hamburger place as an example. So what exactly does McDonald's give to us? Well, it gives us, a number of very low paid jobs, but the profits from McDonald's goes elsewhere, probably to Toronto or US. So the profits go to make some owner of McDonald's very rich. And so we get left with the, jobs, but very poorly paid jobs that don't really go anywhere. Social economy projects operate at an arm's length from the state, so with a lot of power and control within the community. They promote a democratic management process involving all users and workers through its rules and regulation. And democracy and citizen participation is really key here. When I look at the movements that I'm involved in within my community, within my academy, our academy, within the globe, it's really about a reconfiguration of what does democracy mean to us. Is democracy, you vote once every 3 years or every 5 years, and then that's democracy? And we say, no, that's not democracy. Democracy means that every citizen is engaged in what builds strong communities. And, it's kind of interesting and kind of exciting that in education, women are really leading the charge for higher education. It's not to say that men are somehow inferior. It's to say that women have really made a very bold statement about development as it stands is not good enough. And we are going to move forward in both our training and our conversations and in our practices to produce new models, ones that respect women and children, ones that challenge the state, and ones that really safe keep our communities. And social economies defends the primacy of both individuals and work over capital in the distribution of surpluses and revenues. So there's no reason why the top 1% needs to be taken over almost half of the profits. There is no reason at all, except that a lot of them wrote the laws that give them those tax-free rollovers, those breaks on huge incomes, and of course, the way communities are established. And social economies bases their activities on the principles of participation and individual and collective empowerment. And imagine what our communities would be like if children and youth and women had more of a say in how communities are organized. Imagine what that would be like. I imagine it. It's kind of exciting. And next. This is just a bit of reiteration of what I've said previous, but the development of a social economy has to be linked to a vision of social change that is at once the creation of democratic social institutions and the same time is able to be part of wider mobilizations for social and economic justice, making claims on the state and the private sector. I think I'm almost at the end of our PowerPoint here. And they focus on sustainable development, renewable energy, community capital, manufacturing, and independent retention, which become catalysts for civic action, social diversity, and ecological health. So there is no reason for our children to be having epidemic suicide rates. And why is this happening? Well, if we look to children's and youth hope for the future, I think they see it very clearly. And I don't think it is as optimistic as we could be. It could be. I wanted to finally just point to some of the agencies south of the 49th in the name of the Building Alliance for Leading Local Employment. And they utilize economic power that retains power in the local context, and outside interests are secondary, and also at the same time as ensuring healthy ecosystems. So there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of businesses in the state under the Bali tag that have really figured out how to build local economies, and where workers are given, living wages, decent wages, and life is much better than under the current system, the dominant system. So just by summary, local economies operate from a model of democracy, sustainability, and the good life, Bimatswin. And I maintain through a lot of my research and practice that if we follow the principles of cooperation and Bimatswin, good living, in our communities, we have the equipment to sustain this model of development. We need to listen to the communities. We need to look critically at current models of development. Are they inclusive? Are they sustainable? Are they long-term? Do they leave the wealth in the community as opposed to sending it elsewhere? And this model of development has a long history, not only in our province, but throughout the globe. And I'm thinking of the cooperative movement in Spain called the Mondragon cooperative movement, which has not only flourished, but it's grown to other parts of the world, and producing all sorts of very useful household effects, provided good jobs for local communities. So I'm going to end there. It's an exciting possibility, model of development to look forward to that is clearly proven successful. And I think it is up to us to how to deeply understand the model, but also to work with our communities on how to go forward and build stronger, beautiful communities based on all people's intelligence. So I'll quit there. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. I loved hearing this. Like, it really fits well with cooperatives and for people to work together, especially using kind of already established abundance-based approaches, or what we have in our knowledge systems within our own communities, and how they are growing to create these opportunities, and understanding how it's not just creating wealth, but the well-being of everybody. So thank you so much. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Settee or Dr. Walker, please feel free to unmute or raise your hand, type in a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask. While we're waiting for a question, I actually have one. I'm just looking for like if either of you guys have an example like of a firsthand impact that you've seen within a like the social economy construct.
I do. So in the course that Kathy and I developed, we use the Sean Loney, the previous chief of Garden Hill in Manitoba, as examples. And this team of people have developed over 100 social economy projects throughout Canada, primarily in Manitoba. And how they were able to do that was they either sued the government or Manitoba Hydro. They definitely held an action against Manitoba Hydro because Manitoba Hydro flooded over 100 communities, First Nations and Métis communities in northern Manitoba to sell power to non-Indigenous communities in the south. So it was clearly an abrogation of rights, human rights, because even today there are a lot of people that are still flooded and living in Winnipeg as a result of it. So Manitoba Hydro compensated a number of the communities, and they were able to finance social economy projects around energy projects to provide sustainable energy projects that employ local people and are sustainable and keep the profits within. So that's a good news story. I see on the feeds, somebody said, oh, I'm so glad you mentioned Bali in the US. And yes, Bali is, BALLE is an acronym for building local economies. And apparently it has a new name, Common Future. So, if we want to get inspired, we can just, start looking at transformatory development projects and learn to dream differently and learn to pressure governments to actually fund upstream, as we call upstream, and read the work of Sean Loney and Darcy Woods. Kathy, do you have something to add?
Well, sure. I guess I'm just thinking more locally here in Saskatchewan. And I feel like there's just every day there's more and more examples of different communities that are engaging in, helping to build a social economy here. So, like, for example, Atakakut and Mistawasis have both started food forests to not only ensure like their own local food sovereignty, but also in a way that gets away from, the type of industrial farm model, and that truly is like local and grounded in the community, right? And its abundance, I guess you could say, to borrow a term from your podcast, which is really great. And also, here in Saskatoon too. You have examples like Quint Development Corps, which has been, for about the last 20 years, focused on helping to keep, really operating at that intersection between business and also addressing pressing social issues like in the core neighborhood, because Quint Development is situated in the core neighborhood. It's always responded to community needs and issues, so in the core neighborhoods, we have like high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment, no access to healthy foods, and it's systematically, and also lack of housing, like adequate housing. And it's systematically like addressed all of those things through different social business enterprises and entrepreneurship. And like, so for example, you know, it started buying up old, abandoned, I guess you could say, or run down buildings, apartment buildings, and renovated them with local crews, and then would rent them out at a livable rent, you know, so stuff like that. And it also employs people who are supposedly hard to employ, you know, people with criminal records and stuff like that. So, I mean, those are just some example. There's a lot more. So as, you know, as Dr. Settee said, I'm really hopeful. I also think that cooperatives first, and a lot of the work that you're doing right now with Indigenous communities, Trista, also there's some really great examples there too of how communities are really transforming, I think, how we approach economic development.
Maybe, can I just add another couple of plugs here? So this is the book that we use for our course on social economies, one of them. It's called An Army of Problem Solvers by Sean Loney. And it's a history of how some of the social economy projects that Dr. Walker mentioned were organized. That's really excellent book. And then this is another one. It's called Economics for Everyone, done by Jim Stanford, who's a colleague from, he's an economics professor, and it's really a lovely book that I've used in my course. And then something that Kathy mentioned about food, food social economy projects. This is a book that two of us edited on food projects from across Canada, and it was produced in 2020. And it documents food movements all across Canada. And we're working on our second one that document food movements across the globe. So watch for that in 2023. Yes, I forgot to mention Build Up. Build Up is a wonderful organization that is a building co-op that utilizes people, mostly men, but some young women from the gang exiting community. So what we kind of have a giggle about, one of the criterion for getting employed is you have to have a criminal record. And it's amazing the work that has been done here in Saskatoon as well as Winnipeg. And if people are from Winnipeg, you know, go to North End Main Street and check out the social economy projects that are located in the North End. I don't have the name of it, unfortunately, but if you Google social economy projects, Sean Loney, you'll see a whole host of businesses that work with recently released convicts. And I mean, let's face it, a lot of these people are our relatives, my own relatives, and it's really hopeful work. And it's a powerful movement, and it's got deep roots, including parallel ones in the cooperative movement.
Okay. Thank you. I have had a question from Derek, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Houle. I'm from Saddle Lake, Alberta. And one of the things, actually, I've had this conversation with Trista in the past, many years ago, before any of this information became prevalent. One of the things that I'm looking at is, because I'm working in internet, I'm an internet service provider. And one of the things that I'm looking at is, how do we create that as an economic model for all of First Nations communities, but also, you know, basically in the industry that I'm looking at is the all communities that do not have the volume of users are left out of the digital divide. Okay, that's just what we have as a commonality. So how do we present this information to leaderships in different communities? This seems to have a lot of background information, a lot of tools that could be used for educating leaders. And what kind of model have you created to get this information out to communities? Because I know for myself, just without Trista sending me this email, I would not have known about this seminar. And I consider myself well informed because I'm always having to research everything about how do we create, first of all, chattel. In a social development scenario, chattel still becomes an issue, which is equity. How do we create equity to get loans in order to create social economic value, to create projects, to follow those through? That's one of the major things. And I see that there is government grants and everything else, but that has no value if you don't qualify. And that's one of these things that comes up. So I'm looking at all of it, and I can see that part of my question primarily is how do we get this conversation into every First Nations? And I know that we have economic development officers, which are trained by the government, and they're perfect for what they're developed for, which is nothing. And that's the honest truth. If I teach you how to fill a form, and I call you an economic development officer, I've taught you how to fill a form. You don't know anything about actually developing a community. So that type of scenario where we have organizations that represent communities in that type of area, which actually don't fulfill, they're actually fulfilling the economic policy, which we just talked about, reconciliation. So if they actually change that, then economic development officer would actually be somebody who could think on their feet and actually do something for First Nations, bring in resources like this, look at all alternative models of business, looking at the history of why their particular group, whether it's a First Nations community, a Métis settlement, whatever it is, why they are economically isolated. And this is something that doesn't come up. It's not talked about. It's not presented in education. It's not presented in business. It's definitely not talked about with financial institutions, because that would be having to deal with all of it. So this is, I know my question got a little full there, but basically, how do we bring this to the leaderships of every community?
Did you want to go ahead, Priscilla?
Yeah, I do. I really concur with everything you say, that, the present model is not working. So how do we critique it without, undermining our communities? Because people are often honestly trying to make sense of capitalism, and nobody ever uses that word. But so Kathy and I have had deep conversations about how do we move forward. We think we have a good thing, and how we've honored that knowledge is to develop it formally and train young people that there are alternative models, that we can work with the most marginalized, we can work with the youth. The gang exiting youth is who we work with. And there's a malaise out there, a societal malaise that really disempowers our communities. And so I think what we do is we teach, we understand our history as it relates to the kind of communities that we want: women-led, youth observant, child friendly, all of these things that challenge us today. So how do we move forward without shooting, throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Like, how do we develop models? And I think it is first through education, listening and teaching, and then resistance, like really standing up to the forces of destruction. In my province, there's clear cuts, there's stupid silica mines that are going to just totally trash our beautiful communities, hunting and trapping. We have to call that out. And when we call it out, we get into big trouble. So we have to not be afraid of our own power. We must stand up. We must organize as collectives, as we always did. And we need to use everyone's intelligence, because, what we've done with social economy teaching is just what we know. But imagine what all you know And I know, you know, people on this have some amazing talent and knowledge. So imagine what we could do if we say organized a meeting or a conference, a follow-up, and said, like, let's look deeply at this model of development. Let's see who our the seers are. Let's see who are people that are making it happen, and let's give ourselves some optimism, because, you know, right now, I don't know about everybody on this list, but, you know, things can be very depressing. The poverty we see in our communities, it just rips your heart out. The other thing that we did have in Canada, we used to have one of the most healthy social housing and practice policy in the whole world. And then the Liberals took a stab at it, started destroying it. And then the Conservatives totally trashed it. And we have to tell that. We have to say Canada once stood for a national housing policy that produced lovely rental space for mums and kids. And now they've all been bought up by the private sector, or they're sitting empty. And meanwhile, we just have homeless armies on the street. That's not good enough. And we need to be angry about that. But we need to be angry in a productive way to convince people that we can do better. We must do better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Derek, I'll just add to Priscilla's answer a little bit. And I love what you have to say. And I completely agree with you. It would be really great if they taught in business schools, and they taught, you know, Indigenous peoples when they're training them for economic development, that they taught them that, you know, you can focus on building a social economy. But yeah, this is not taught, and that, you know, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So education definitely is a big piece for sure. But we definitely need to do a better job of getting the knowledge out there to the people who can actually implement it on the ground. Just let them know, like, you have options. You don't have to follow, you know, someone else's idea of what development is. So that's definitely, you know, an ongoing issue. And like, I mean, there's just such a big bureaucracy and a matrix of policy and systems that are opposed to that act as barriers, right? Because they're used to doing things a certain way, and their jobs and systems depend on it at the same time, right? And so we're dealing with that. And so for me, you know, in addition to education, one of the key areas is to change the policy so that it is more supportive of social economy building. And I think that, you know, we have Section 92, so, you know, we can leverage something like that. We have FPIC. We have this new federal law that is supposedly implementing UNDRIP. Okay, so now what will that look like on the ground in terms of economic development? You know, and I think there's a real potential there for sure to insert Indigenous ways of knowing and being, which I think are definitely aligned with social economies and the cooperative type of business model. So yeah, so I would say policy, definitely we need to get in there, and we need to be really vocal and say and leverage some of the legislative actions that have been taken in response to UNDRIP. They're supposed to be implementing it in free, prior, informed consent, and really translate that into movement on the ground. Right now, it's not looking so great. Like, I mean, you know, BC has its own UNDRIP legislation, right? That's supposed to make all of its policy and laws consistent with UNDRIP. But, you know, in 2021, one of the First Nations actually brought the BC government to court, because they said that, you know, you guys are failing to implement UNDRIP because you have not changed your mining policies at all. And so, you know, we feel as a First Nation that, that we do not have any say. Like we have not, you know, we do not have free, prior, and informed consent here happening because it's still business as usual, you know, so stuff like that, right? So, but at least there's some accountability now. There's some leverage that that, you know, nations and communities can point to, right? So anyway, sorry, that's my long-winded answer, but thank you so much for your question. I think it's a crucial question.
And I would like to add that we really need to understand that the 1% is well organized. And if we're going to be a force similar, we really need to understand how deep those roots of organization lie. For example, Milton Friedman, who was an economist way back when, he developed the Chicago School of Economics. And just to give you a sense of how evil this brand of development is they took young people from all over the world and trained them in this Chicago School of Economics, and then sent these young people out to like their countries to be the economic development people to set up this neoliberalism mode of development. So the right wing, I call them the right wing, the 1%, the wealthy, are very well organized, and we need to be as well organized. We need to understand the history of how imperialism, colonialism operate to keep us on our knees, how they try to co-opt our own leaders, and we all have examples of that, with all due respect, and how we must be an informed force if we're going to really be rethinking community development from the ground up. We have very powerful adversaries, but we also have the power of Indigenous, which is nothing like it on earth, I'm telling you. So, yeah.
So just one last question. Do you have next steps for this type of information to be going out to the world? Do you have an organizational structure, a body, a proposal, or a mission, a time frame? Are we going to wait for the next 100 years, or are we going to do it within 20, within 10?
Well, I mean, it's an ongoing job. I've been teaching for practically 40 years, and it has been a lifelong job of mine to teach young people, to listen to young people, and to build, you know, communities of strong women and children. I mean, there is so much work to do. It boggles my mind. You know, we've got all of the caring projects in our community that involve women and children. I just finished a study on trafficked women and children. It is a crisis on the prairie provinces. Our women are being stolen. So where do we focus our energy? Well, that's one area. We need to really ensure the safety of women and children. And the men can help do that too, of course. We need to hold leaders accountable. We need to create spaces where we can, like in universities, in community. I would love to do a follow-up to this webinar. I would love to do that. I would love to organize a conference or help organize a conference to look for money. I do work with the Indian collective out of South Dakota that stopped the pipeline, or parts of it, the XL pipeline. So I'm still working with them. And what really makes me hopeful is their model of development of tribal schools that, you know, focus on the well-being of children. And they have garnered a lot of support from a lot of millionaires, believe it or not. And recently they were just awarded like a big sack of money to continue their important work. So those models we are attached to. I'm one of their advisors, and they're doing marvelous work, youth-led. Like I don't think there's a person over, most of them are under 40, and phenomenal thinkers and highly skilled organizers. So we need to look at other models. Maybe we can do step 2 of this. I would be more than happy to help.
Yeah.
And we have to hold our co-ops accountable too, you know. I've seen them slide into very murky capitalist models, you know, and we have to say that, and we have to hold our board of directors accountable.
Mhm.
And I think we can do that.
Yeah. So Derek, I'll just add that I actually did do a search to see if there were any Indigenous social economy institutes or organizations that were just dedicated to that throughout Canada, and then a little bit into the States. The First Nations Development Institute, I think in the US, is much more oriented towards social economy building than any other organization I've come across. But really in Canada, I couldn't really find anything other than like some social economy institutes and some really great cooperative development institutes and stuff. And they're usually tied to, a lot of them are tied to universities and colleges. So that's what I found. And I don't think I found any, maybe, I think there might've been one based out of BC that was really focusing on stuff like food sovereignty and an Indigenous economy building. And there's also like the Yellowhead Institute out of Ryerson has done a lot of really great research on economic reconciliation, I guess, or like Indigenous economy building. They have this one report called Cashback. So it's kind of like, it's like the economic equivalent of land back. So yeah, there's some really good stuff that's out there, but in terms of like a really strong cohesive network of community-based organizations and nations and First Nations, Indigenous nations that are really dedicated and able to mobilize knowledge and training around Indigenous and social economy building, I haven't really come across anything like that. But that doesn't mean that it can't be built. I was actually thinking it would be great to start an institute like that here in Saskatchewan. But again, you know, we need to start like 10 years ago with this, you know, but if we could start now, and I think that would be great too. And I would definitely be willing to help out.
Mm-hmm.
Great questions, Derek. Like, I mean, wow. Mm-hmm.
And especially in your field of communications, why is it that northern communities don't have I think it's called bandwidth, or like the communication strategy, the money invested in those communities?
Broadband. And it's really simple. It's Rogers, Telus, Bell. They get the majority of the money for infrastructure in Canada. So the UBF is not representative of all communities across Canada, period.
Right.
But,
yeah.
So when the money's spent, you'll see that most of the communities are still without services, and the majority of that money will be going to Telus and Shaw and Rogers. And that's just the way the system is designed. It's imperfect, and they know it. They know that they screwed up with all that money, but and there is a lot to be done just from the First Nations side and the non-First Nations side. Anybody near a community has just as much effect from that money going out to those corporations. So smaller organizations don't get that in Canada. So social enterprise doesn't exist because you still won't be able to apply for the money to get the grant because you don't fit their model. That's just design of the economic policy in the government. So fiduciary responsibility is continuously missed. And that's just what's so.
Yeah, it's that's such a similar story when it comes to almost any sort of economic development activity that you want to undertake. You know, there's all those barriers.
Well, it works perfectly. That's the way the system was designed, and it's still working. So it's not that it's changed or that somebody's tried to change it. This is a perfect system. So now we know. That's it. Now we can do something about it.
So is just for the sake of time, does anybody else have any other questions? Well, okay, so if there are no other questions, like I know we did go actually quite a bit over time, so I want to thank everybody for who stuck around to hear the conversation, and like I just want to thank everybody for attending this session. So we will be putting the Your Way Together webinars on pause for the summer, but we will be back this fall. So please stay tuned. In the meantime, if you have any questions or potential projects or ways of gathering or anything, please feel free to reach out to me. If you have an idea or would like to hear more on what type of webinar we could bring you, like I really want to make these webinars interactive and of interest to the audience. Like I would love to have a coffee, either virtually or in person. Feel free to reach out to me and we can continue talking and discussing. So we also have the monthly newsletter that highlights what's going on with Indigenous co-ops, kind of our recaps of what we've been working on this month and anything coming up. And we also provide tools that we've created. So for the newsletter, please sign up at yourwaytogether.ca. And a big thank you to Priscilla and Kathy for joining me today and sharing their knowledge with us. So until next time, with this, see you again.
Thank you.